I was 41 years old and I hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to a woman in 6 years when I signed my name to the first lie of my life. I want that understood before I tell the rest, because a man ought to own the beginning of a thing. The lie wasn't hers. It was mine. I started it, sitting at my own kitchen table with a lamp guttering and a letter in front of me I had no earthly way of writing. And I have thought many times since that the Lord has a wry humor, because the woman I sent for turned out to be lying too in her own careful way, and it took the both of us the better part of a summer to stop and just tell the truth to one another. When we finally did, it was the plainest, best day of my life. But I'm ahead of myself. Let me start where it started, out on the meadowlark. The fall the sweetgrass came in tall, and I decided I was tired of eating supper alone. My wife Ruth had been dead 6 years by then. She went in the winter of a fever that took hold quick and wouldn't let go, and I buried her under the cottonwood at the top of the home pasture where she liked to sit of an evening. We'd had no children, which was a grief of its own, though I didn't let myself dwell on it. After she passed, I did what a certain kind of man does, which is to say I worked. I worked the way another man drinks. I ran cattle on that stretch of Wyoming grass from Kansas to Kansas, and I let the quiet close over the house like water over a stone, and I told myself I was fine. A man can tell himself that a long time. Longer than you'd credit. What broke it in the end was a small thing. It was my hired man, Tobias Lund, reading a letter aloud at the bunkhouse one supper. Tobias was a young fellow then, maybe 24, gangling and freckled, with more learning in him than the whole rest of the outfit combined. His mother had been a schoolteacher back in Ohio, and had drilled her letters into him before she died, and he'd carried a little box of books all the way west that he set more store by than his own saddle. This particular evening, he was reading a letter from a cousin of his who'd gone and got herself a husband through the newspaper. A mail-order match, they called it. You wrote an advertisement, or you answered one, and you courted a stranger by post until the two of you agreed to marry, and then she came out on the train. Tobias thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard, a person picking a spouse off a page like ordering seed from a catalog, and the other hands laughed along with him. I didn't laugh. I sat there with my coffee going cold, and I felt something turn over in me that I hadn't felt in a long while, and it took me a moment to name it, and when I named it, it was want. Plain and simple. I was lonesome down to the marrow and had been for years, and here was Tobias reading out a thing that said, in so many words, a lonesome man doesn't have to stay that way. I didn't say anything about it that night. I was not a man who said things. My whole life I'd been the quiet one, the one who nodded when other folks talked, who did his speaking with his hands and his work, who could sit a whole meal and never open his mouth and not feel he'd missed a thing. Ruth used to say I hoarded my words like a squirrel hoards nuts, saving them up against some winter that never came. She'd say it kind, and she'd fill the silence for the both of us, easy as breathing, and it had never once occurred to me that when she was gone I'd have no one to fill it, and that the silence I'd been so comfortable in would turn on me and become a hard thing to bear. So I brooded on it a week. Then one night I couldn't stand my own company another hour, and I went out to the bunkhouse and I found Tobias by lamplight mending a bridle, and I asked him could a man do that? The letter thing. Could a man like me do it? He looked at me a long moment. I expect I was a sight, standing there in the doorway with my hat in my hands like a boy asking a favor. You'd have to write to her, Mr. Renfrew, he said, careful. Back and forth. That's how it's done. You'd have to court her on paper first. And there it was, the whole trouble laid out in one sentence. Because I could not write. Oh, I could sign my name, and I could read a brand and a tally sheet, and the price of beef in the paper if I went slow and moved my lips. But I'd had maybe 2 years of schooling in my whole life, back in Missouri before my father died and put me to work, and a pen in my hand felt like a snake. To sit down and write out my heart to a woman, to court her, to make her laugh, to make her want to cross half a country to a man she'd never seen. I could no more have done it than flown. I stood there in the bunkhouse doorway, and I felt the want in me curdle into shame, and I nearly turned around and went back to my empty house and let the whole notion die. But I didn't, and here is the beginning of my lie. I looked at Tobias Lund, at that boy with his schoolteacher mother's letters in his fingers and his box of books, and I said, "What if you was to write them for me, and I told you what to say?" He set the bridle down. To his credit, he didn't laugh. He was a good boy. "You want me to write your love letters," he said, just making sure he had it right. "I'll tell you what to put," I said. "It'll be my meaning, your hand my meaning. That ain't lying." Even as I said it, I knew it wasn't quite the truth, but I said it anyway, the way you do. Tobias was quiet a spell. Then he said, "All right, Mr. Renfrew, I'll write them. But I'll tell you now, a woman reads more than the words. She reads the man behind them. You start this, you'd best be ready to be the man she thinks she's writing to." I didn't understand him then. I understood him later, all the way down to the ground. But that night I just nodded and said we'd start Sunday, and I went back across the yard to the dark house feeling, for the first time in 6 years, like something might be about to happen to me. We wrote the advertisement first. Or Tobias wrote it and I stood over his shoulder saying, "Take that out, that's too much," and him putting it back in because he said a woman wanted a little warmth, not a stock report. What we ended up with I still remember because I made him read it to me a dozen times. Rancher, 40, sober and settled, of a quiet nature but a steady heart, seeks a good woman to share a home and the work of it on a fine stretch of Wyoming grass. Widower, no children. A man more given to doing than to talking, but faithful in all things, seeks the same in her. That last part was Tobias's, seeks the same in her. I remember thinking it a fine touch, though I couldn't have said why. We sent it off to a paper back east that ran such things, and I put the whole business out of my mind the way you do a seed you've planted. And then 6 weeks later a letter came for me at the Mercantile in Holly's Crossing, and I rode home with it inside my coat like it was a live coal, and I laid it on the kitchen table, and I stared at it a long while before I saddled back up and fetched Tobias to read it to me. It was from a woman who signed herself Mrs. Cordelia Vane. I have that letter yet. I have all of them in a tin box, and I've read them so many times I could recite them, and I could recite them, near about, even now, an old man with his eyes going. She wrote a fine hand, a lady's hand, all loops and confidence, and she wrote that she was a widow of some means, lately of Baltimore, that her late husband had left her comfortable, but that comfort was cold company for a woman alone. She wrote that she had read my advertisement and had been struck, she said, by the honesty of a man who admitted to being quiet, when the other advertisements she'd seen were all so full of themselves. "A man who does not boast," she wrote, "is a man who has nothing to hide. I have come to prize that above almost anything." She asked what my country looked like. She asked what I did in the evenings. She asked, at the very end, in a smaller hand as though she'd hesitated over it, whether I was lonely, because she was, and she was tired of pretending she wasn't. Tobias finished reading and looked up at me, and I found I couldn't quite speak. That last line had gone into me like a knife going into good ground, clean, all the way. I am tired of pretending I am not. I knew that pretending. I'd been doing it 6 years. "Write her back," I said when I could. My voice came out rough. "Tonight." And so began the strangest, sweetest courtship a man ever conducted, which is to say a courtship I hardly conducted at all. Because here is the thing I have to confess. Those letters, the ones that went east under my name, were mine only in the way a house is the owner's when another man built it. I'd tell Tobias my meaning. I'd say, "Tell her the country looks like the sea if the sea was made of grass. Tell her the evenings are the hardest part. Tell her I keep my wife's chair at the table still and I don't know why," and Tobias would take my rough plain saying and he would turn it into something with music in it. He was a gifted boy. He'd write, "The grass here rolls to the mountains like a green sea, and a man alone in the middle of it learns the size of his own smallness. The evenings are the hardest." I keep a chair at my table that has been empty 6 years, and I have never found the heart to move it, nor the sense to say why. Perhaps you will understand that, being lonely yourself. I think you might. And I'd stand there listening and I'd think, yes, that's it. That's exactly the thing I couldn't say, and I'd sign my name to it, and it would go east, and it wasn't a lie, not exactly, because every bit of the meaning was mine. But the man Cordelia Vane was falling in love with, letter by letter, all that summer, that man could talk. That man had music in him, and I did not. Tobias warned me. I'll give the boy that a second time because he earned it. Along about the fourth or fifth letter, when it had got to where I'd ride in from the range early just to see was there anything at the Mercantile, when I'd started dreaming about a woman I'd never laid eyes on, Tobias set down the pen one night and he said, "Mr. Renfrew, this has gone past a mail-order arrangement. She's in love with the man in these letters. And that man," he tapped the paper, "that man ain't altogether you. When she comes, she's going to meet you, not him. And I won't be standing at your elbow to do your talking." "I'll manage," I said. "You'll manage," he repeated, and I heard the doubt in it, and I ignored it, because a man in the grip of a want will ignore near about anything. She wrote that she would come. It was August by then. She wrote that she had settled her affairs in Baltimore and would take the train west, and she named the day, and she wrote this last letter I remember whole. I confess I am frightened, Mr. Renfrew. Not of you, of being seen. A woman gets used to being alone the way you speak of, and there is a kind of safety in it in never being truly looked at. But I have decided I would rather be seen and found wanting than stay safe and stay alone. I am coming. Whatever I find, I am glad I wrote to you. You have been the truest correspondent of my life. And then under her name, one more line, the smallest yet. I hope you will like me. I am not always the woman my letters make me sound, but my heart in them is true. I didn't think anything of that line at the time. I thought it was a woman being modest. I know now it was a woman doing exactly what I was doing, telling me, as plain as she dared, that there was a difference between the letters and the life, and hoping I'd be gentle about it when I found out. The day she was to come, I did a thing I hadn't done since I married Ruth. I bathed in the middle of the week and put on my one good shirt, and I had Tobias trim my hair with the horse shears, and I drove the buckboard into Holly's, crossing an hour early, and sat outside the depot in the heat, sweating through the good shirt, rehearsing. I had made Tobias write me out things to say. I had them on a scrap of paper in my pocket, greetings, pleasantries, a little speech of welcome. And I sat there, and I read them over and over, moving my lips, and the more I read them the more foolish they sounded in my own head, in my own voice, which was nothing like the voice on the paper. The train came in a great gust of smoke and shriek. I stood up off the bench. My mouth was dry as chalk. People got down, a drummer with his sample case, a family, 2 ranch wives from up the valley, and I stood there searching for a genteel Baltimore widow of means, a fine woman in silk, the lady those Loopsend confidence letters had drawn in my mind. I was looking so hard for that woman that I didn't see the one who was actually there, until she was standing near about in front of me. She was not a genteel widow of means. I saw that in the first half a second, and I am not proud of what I felt, which was a lurch of pure disappointment, quick and ugly, before I got hold of myself. She was a working woman. You couldn't mistake it. She wore a good dress, but it was a plain one, dark, mended careful at one cuff where I could see the stitches if I looked. She carried one carpet-bag, not a trunk. And her hands, I noticed her hands right off because they were like mine, like my mother's had been. They were a laboring woman's hands, red and roughened, the knuckles big, one thumbnail cracked and grown back wrong. She was maybe 35. She had a strong, plain, handsome face, not a pretty one, with a wide mouth and steady gray eyes, and those eyes were going over me the same instant mine were going over her. And I watched her see me, see the sweat and the shears-cut hair and the good shirt on a big, rough, silent man. And I watched something flinch behind her face and then get covered over, quick, the way you'd throw a blanket over a fire you didn't want seen. "Mr. Renfrew," she said, and her voice, I'll remember her voice till I die. Her voice was low and a little rough itself, a working voice, nothing like the silk I'd built in my head from her fine hand on the page. "Yes," I said, and then I ran out. Every word Tobias had written on that scrap in my pocket went straight out of my skull. I stood there with my hat in my two rough hands, and I could not produce one single thing to say to her. And the silence stretched out between us on that hot depot platform until it was a physical thing, a wall, and I saw the hope die a little more in those steady gray eyes. And still, I could not speak. "I'm Cordelia," she said finally to fill it. And even in my misery I heard the smallest catch on the name, the tiniest hitch, the way you'd stumble over a word in a language not your own. "I'll take your bag," I said. It was all I had, 4 words. And I picked up her carpetbag and I turned and walked to the buckboard, and she followed me, and neither of us said one more thing until we were a mile out of town. That was the first day. I have laid it out slow because I want you to see how it was, 2 people who'd fallen in love with paper, standing on a platform meeting the flesh, and each of us seeing right off that the flesh didn't match the paper, and each of us too proud and too scared and too raised up to just say so. She wasn't the silk widow. I wasn't the man with music. And instead of laughing about it, which is what we should have done, which is what we did do finally on the best day of my life, we set our jaws and drove out to the Meadowlark in a silence you could have cut and stacked like sod, each of us privately convinced the other was disappointed, each of us right, and each of us bound and determined not to be the first to let the ruse slip. Because I want to be fair to her and to myself. Neither of us had come to cheat the other. We'd come lonely and hopeful, and we'd each of us dressed ourselves up a little for the meeting the way you'd wear your good shirt. She'd made herself a lady on the page. I'd borrowed a boy's music, and we'd each done it out of the same fear, which was the fear that the true plain self wouldn't be enough. "I'm not always the woman my letters make me sound," she'd written. "A man more given to doing than to talking," I'd advertised, hedging even then. We were 2 of a kind and didn't know it yet, and we spent a good long while making each other miserable before we found it out. The ride to the ranch was the longest 6 miles of my life. She sat beside me on the buckboard seat with her spine straight as a fence rail, holding onto her fine lady manner with both hands, and every so often she'd say something in a careful, genteel way. She remarked on the vista. She called it a vista, and I'd grunt something back, and the effort of it hung off her like a wet coat. Once going over a rough patch, the buckboard jolted hard and she grabbed the seat rail without thinking, and I heard her hiss between her teeth, a real sound, a working woman's sound. And for just a second the fine manner dropped clean off her and she said, "Lord, these ruts," in her own true rough voice, and then she caught it and colored and put the lady back on. I didn't say anything, but I'd heard it. And something in me leaned toward that second voice, the true one, the way a plant leans at a window. The house, when we came to it, embarrassed me. I saw it new through her eyes, a good enough house, sound, but a bachelor's house, a widower's house, 6 years of a man not caring. Dust on the sills. Ruth's chair still at the table, just like the letter said, and now I was ashamed of that letter, ashamed of having handed a boy my private grief to make pretty. I got her bag down and I showed her the room I'd fixed up, which was Ruth's and my old room, that I'd moved out of and into the small room off the kitchen. And I stood in the doorway not knowing how to say any of what a man should say. And she stood in the middle of the room looking at it, at the clean quilt I'd put on and the wildflowers I'd stuck in a jar because Tobias said I ought to, and she was quiet a long time. Then she said, not turning around, in a voice that had gone careful again, "It's a fine house, Mr. Renfrew." And I heard the lie in it, heard her being a lady about a bachelor's dusty house. And God help me, instead of understanding it as the kindness it was, I heard it as her looking down on me, and something in me went hard and cold, and I said, "It ain't fine. But it's honest work holds it up," which was a mean thing to say, or came out mean, and I saw her back stiffen, and I turned and went out to see to the horses so I wouldn't say anything worse. That was how we started, I'm not proud of it. We were married 3 days later, because that was the arrangement and neither of us knew how to unarrange it. The preacher came out from Holly's Crossing on a Thursday and married us in the front room with Tobias and my old cook Absalom for witnesses. And Cordelia, I'll call her that still, for now, the way I knew her then, Cordelia stood beside me in her one good dress with her rough hands folded, and said the words in her careful voice. And I said mine in my rough one, and it was the coldest wedding you ever saw, two strangers promising forever across a gulf neither would step over. When the preacher said I could kiss her, I did, barely, a dry press of my mouth to her cheek, and I felt her go rigid, and I stepped back fast, and I saw in her face the same thing I was feeling, which was, what have I done? We lived like boarders those first weeks. She kept the house, kept it fierce. I'll say that the dust was gone by the second day and never came back, and she could cook rings around old Absalom, which he resented and then respected, in that order, inside a week. But she kept up the lady the whole time, and it near about killed her to do it, I could see, because a genteel Baltimore widow of means does not know how to render lard or wring a chicken's neck or beat a rug till the dust flies, and Cordelia knew how to do all of those things, knew them in her hands, and I'd watch her start to do a thing the quick, sure-working way and then catch herself, and do it the slow, fine way she thought a lady would, and get it wrong, and be mortified. She was working twice as hard to seem like she'd never worked. And I was doing the very same thing with words, grunting and going silent, terrified to open my mouth because the man on the paper would not come out of it, letting her think me sullen and cold when the truth was I was just a plain man who couldn't talk, drowning in the effort of pretending I was the one who could. Two people can't keep that up forever. The truth leaks. It leaked in 100 small ways over those weeks, little cracks in both our ruses, and each crack, though we didn't know it, was the truth trying to get out and get us free. The first real crack was her hands. About the second week she quit wearing gloves in the house. It was too hot, and there was no keeping house in gloves. And one morning I came in for coffee and she was kneading bread, and her sleeves were up, and I stood in the doorway and looked at her forearms and her wrists and those big-knuckled, crack-nailed hands working the dough, sure and strong and beautiful in the way a thing that knows its work is beautiful. And she felt me looking and stopped, and I watched the shame flood up her neck. She yanked her sleeves down over the flour and said, "Stiff, forgive me. I know it's unseemly." And I said, and this was the first true thing I'd managed to say to her since the platform, I said, "My mother had hands like that. I always thought they were the finest hands I ever saw." She went very still. She looked at me. It was the first time since she'd come that we'd looked at each other straight, no ruse between us, and I saw those gray eyes fill and then get hard against it, and she turned back to the bread and said, "Lo, well, your mother must have been a woman who worked then." And I said, she was, worked herself into the ground for us and never complained of it once. And Cordelia said nothing, but she kept her sleeves up the rest of that day, and I noticed, and she knew I noticed, and something eased by a hair's breadth between us. The second crack was mine, and it was worse, because it was the whole of my ruse laid bare, and I didn't even do it on purpose. It was maybe the third week. There'd come a letter not from her, from a cattle buyer, a business matter, and it was full of terms I couldn't puzzle out fast, and I was sitting at the kitchen table after supper laboring over it, moving my lips, sounding out the hard words like a schoolboy, my ears burning even though I thought I was alone. I wasn't alone. She'd come to the doorway with the coffee pot and she stood there and she watched me. I didn't know how long. When I finally felt her and looked up, she was standing dead still with the pot in her hand, and her face was doing something I couldn't read. I felt the shame come up in a wave. Here it was, the thing I'd hid, the rancher who wrote such fine letters, sounding out contingent like a 6-year-old. I stood up so fast the chair went over. "It's business," I said, hard, daring her to say a word. "Cattle business, nothing that concerns you." And she looked at me another long moment, and then she did the last thing on earth I expected. She set down the coffee pot and she came over and she picked up the letter and she said, in a voice that had gone quiet and careful in a wholly different way than before, not the lady voice, something under it, "It's a poor hand he writes. Half these words run together. Shall I read it out? I read a fair bit. It was expected of me. Reading." She was giving me a way through. She was pretending the trouble was his hand and not my eyes, handing me a rope so I wouldn't drown. And she did it so kind and so quick that I understood, in that moment, that she'd known maybe from the start, maybe from watching me flounder for words on the platform, that the man in the letters and the man in the kitchen were two different men. She'd known, and she hadn't said, and now she was covering for me the way you'd cover for anyone you decided, against all sense, to be tender toward. I should have told her then. I have wished 1,000 times I'd told her right then, sat back down and said, "Cordelia, or whoever you are, I never wrote those letters, a boy wrote them. I can't hardly read, I'm sorry, I'm a fraud and a lonesome fool, and I'm sorry." She'd have told me hers in the same breath, I know it now, and we'd have saved ourselves a month of misery, but I didn't. I was too proud and too raw from being seen. I let her read the letter out and I muttered a thanks and I took myself off to the little room off the kitchen and lay awake half the night. But something had turned. She'd seen the worst of me, the ignorant, tongue-tied truth of me, and instead of scorn, she'd offered me a rope. And I lay there and thought, whoever she is, she's kind. Kinder than the silk widow on the paper, kinder than I've any right to. After that it got easier and harder at the same time. Easier because we quit fighting the small truths so hard. I'd catch her doing a thing the quick working way, and she'd catch me catching her, and neither of us made anything of it. She read my business letters out plain, and I stopped pretending I didn't need it. I'd say a real thing now and again, short and plain, and she'd started answering in her own true rough voice more and more, the lady slipping off her a little further each day like a costume she was tired of wearing. And harder because the more the ruses cracked, the more the real people showed through them, and the real people, I'll just say it, the real people were starting to matter to each other, and neither of us knew what to do about that, married strangers who'd each married a fiction. I started finding reasons to be near the house. A man who'd lived on his horse for 6 years, and suddenly I was mending the corral by the kitchen window, fixing the porch step that hadn't wanted fixing in a decade. She started sending Tobias out with coffee and then, by and by, bringing it herself and standing a minute in the sun, and once she stayed and looked out over the grass a long while and said, in her own voice, no lady in it at all, "You weren't lying about the one thing anyway. It does look like the sea." And I said, "What one thing?" And she caught herself and colored and said, in the advertisement. The grass like a sea." And I couldn't tell her that was Tobias, that the sea was Tobias's, so I just said, "It's the truest thing about the place," which was as close to honest as I could come, and she nodded, and we stood there in the sun not talking, and it was the first silence between us that didn't hurt. I could tell you a dozen more of those. The evening the milk cow got out and we chased her half a mile in the dark, and Cordelia hiked her fine dress up to her knees and ran like a girl and hollered like a hand, and we got the cow and stood there both of us laughing, actually laughing, the first laughing either of us had done, and she caught herself and put a hand over her mouth like she'd committed a sin, and I said, "Don't," before I could think. "Don't stop, I like the sound of it." And she took her hand down slow and looked at me, and something passed between us that I felt in my chest for an hour after. The night Absalom took sick, and she nursed him through a hard fever 3 days with no more thought of ladyhood than a plow horse, and I watched her wring cloths and spoon broth and speak low and gentle to a cranky old cook who wasn't kin to her and never would be, and I thought, this is a good woman, whoever she is under the paper widow. This is a good woman, and I have been a fool to spend 3 weeks pining after a fiction when the truth of her is standing in my house being finer than any fiction could be. But we still hadn't said it, either of us. The ruses were down to threads by then, but a thread's still a thread, and pride is a terrible strong thing, and I think we both feared the same thing, that if we said out loud I'm not who I pretended, the other one would feel cheated, would feel they'd been made a fool of, would take the wagon back to the depot. So we held our threads. until the day they broke both at once, which is the day I've been coming to all along, the plainest best day of my life. It was the end of September. There'd come a spell of fine weather, the aspens going gold up the draws, and I'd got it in my head to do a thing I hadn't planned and could barely account for, which was to take her up to the top of the home pasture, to the cottonwood, to Ruth's grave. I don't rightly know why. I think I wanted her to see the whole of it, the truth of me, the grief I'd handed a boy to make pretty in a letter. I think some part of me had decided the time for threads was over, and I was reaching for a way to cut mine that didn't take words, because words were never my way. So after the noon meal, I asked her would she walk up the hill with me, and she looked at me curious and wiped her hands and said she would. We walked up through the tall grass, and it did roll like a gold-green sea, and at the top under the cottonwood was the stone with Ruth's name, and I stood there with my hat off not knowing how to begin. And Cordelia stood beside me and read the stone, and she was quiet, and then she said, "Genteel, your wife." "Ruth," I said, "6 years." The letter where it said I keep her chair, that was true. All the true things in those letters were true. And there it stuck. The whole confession, right there in my throat, and it wouldn't come. And Cordelia, she was looking at the stone, not at me. Cordelia said, very low, "You didn't write them, though, did you?" The world went still. Even the wind laid down. "I've known since the platform," she said, still soft, still looking at the stone. "A man doesn't write like that and then stand mute in front of the woman he wrote to. I watched you try to find a word out there, and I knew. Those letters were somebody's, but they weren't the man in front of me. And her voice caught, and she pressed her lips and made herself go on. I couldn't say anything, Silas. Because I was doing the same thing. I've been doing it the whole time. And I've been so ashamed and so afraid you'd send me back, that I've let you go on thinking me a cold, proud thing when I'm." And here it broke out of her all at once, the truth, tumbling. "When I'm no widow of means, I never was, there's no money and there's no Baltimore house. There's a wash house in Baltimore where I took in laundry 16 years. My hands are like this because I've scrubbed other folks' linen since I was 19. My husband didn't leave me comfortable. He left me nothing. He drank himself dead and left me nothing but debts. And my name isn't even Cordelia, was a name I picked because it sounded like a lady. My name is Della, plain Della Ray. And I made the whole fine woman up out of nothing because I was afraid a used-up washerwoman with cracked hands would get her advertisement thrown in the fire. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I've lied to you since the first line I wrote." And she was crying now, standing at my dead wife's grave, confessing herself into ruin, certain she'd bought herself a one-way ticket back to the wash house. And I started to laugh. I couldn't help it. It came up out of me from 6 years down, from 20 years down, from the bottom of my whole silent, lonesome life. And it wasn't cruel, and she knew it wasn't because I got hold of her hands, both her rough, cracked, beautiful hands in both of mine. And I got the words out between the laughing, the truest, easiest words I'd ever said in my life. "Della. Della, I can't hardly read. I've maybe 2 years of school in me. I can sign my name and I can read a tally, and that's the size of it. Those letters, everyone a hired boy wrote them, Tobias. My hand, his words, because I wanted you, and I knew a woman wouldn't cross the country for a man who can't string 10 words together. I've been just as scared as you. I've been dying of it. I thought if you found out what a plain, dumb, tongue-tied fool you'd married, you'd take the next train east. Della, we're the same. We're the exact same lie." She stopped crying. She stared at me. And then the Lord's wry humor again. She started laughing too, both of us standing there at Ruth's grave laughing till we couldn't breathe, holding onto each other's ruined hands, two lonesome liars who'd each been so busy hiding their plain, true self that they'd near about missed the fact that the other one had come all this way looking for exactly that. Plain, true, enough. "When we could talk again," I said, and I meant it more than I've ever meant anything. "I don't want Cordelia. I never wanted Cordelia. I couldn't talk to Cordelia. She scared me half to death. I want the woman who chased a cow through the dark with her skirts up. I want Della Ray with the cracked hands, who nursed my old cook and read out my letters and never once let me drown. That's the woman I married. I just didn't know it was allowed to be her. And Della at last, all the way, no lady left on her anywhere. Della put her rough hand up against my rough jaw and she said in her own low, true voice, "And I don't want the man who wrote the C. I want the one who can't say it. The one who fixed a porch step for a month just to be near the kitchen. The one who told me his mother's hands were the finest he ever saw." She was crying again, but it was different crying. I've been loved on paper before, Silas. My husband could write pretty when he was sober. I'm done being loved on paper. I want to be loved plain. So I loved her plain, from that hour on. I never was a talker and I never got to be one. I'm an old man now and I still hoard my words like that squirrel Ruth teased me about, but I found out a thing up on that hill that I've held to ever since, which is that a marriage isn't built out of the fine words. It's built out of the plain, true self you're finally brave enough to hand the other person, cracks and all, and trust them not to throw it in the fire. Della handed me hers. I handed her mine. We'd both spent so long being scared of that, of being seen and found wanting, like she'd written in that last letter. And it turned out the seeing was the whole of it. Being seen down to the cracknail truth of you and being kept anyway. That was the thing we'd both crossed half a country hoping for, and been too frightened to just ask for straight. We walked back down the hill in the gold afternoon holding hands, and it was no ruse in it anywhere. And that night at supper she sat in her own place, not Ruth's, and she talked in her own rough voice and I listened, which was ever my gift, the listening, and we were easy. I had Tobias write one last letter that week, dictated it myself, plain as I could, a letter to no one just for us that said this is the true account. Silas Renfrew, who cannot write, married Della Ray, who is no widow of means, and they were both liars and are both forgiven, and it is the best thing either ever did. Della keeps it in the tin box with all the false ones. She says the false ones got us here, so she won't throw them out, and I expect she's right, though I've never fully forgiven them for how near they came to costing us the truth. She's up on that hill now too, my Della. Went 2 winters back, an old woman with those same cracked hands I loved to the last, and I put her under the cottonwood next to Ruth because there was room, and because Della said once in her plain way that a good man's got hard enough for 2 graves and she wasn't the jealous kind. I go up most evenings. I don't say much, never did. But I sit, and I look out at the grass rolling gold green to the mountains like a sea. And I think about a woman who invented a lady because she was scared a washerwoman wasn't enough, and a man who borrowed a boy's music because he was scared his own plain voice wasn't enough, and how the 2 of them found out, late and lucky, that the plain true selves they'd been so ashamed of were the very things the other one had been praying for all along. Everything he'd prayed for, that's what she was, not the woman she promised on the paper. The one who stepped off the train with a cracked thumbnail and a carpetbag and a whole invented life she was too tired to keep up. The plain true one, everything I'd prayed for and been too scared to ask for straight. I just wish I'd started with the truth. But then most of us don't. Most of us dress up first and hope. The lucky ones get found out by someone kind and get to lay the costume down and get loved plain after all. I was one of the lucky ones. I've thought so every evening for 30 years, sitting up there in the gold, an old plain quiet man, hoarding my words at peace.